Welcome to another episode of the ACER podcast. So far we have explored the fields of physics, computer science, chemistry, sociology, robotics and many others. Today we will be talking with ACER collaborator about climate change and everything related to the topic. With us is Dr. Janez Potočnik, who is a co-chair at the UN International Resource Panel and former European Commissioner for Research and Environment. Thank you very much for joining us today. Dr. Potočnik, so you have had a very interesting career journey and you are involved in many different things. Could you please give us a bit of a background on how you started your professional journey and where you are right now?
Basically, I'm an economist. So I studied from the beginning till the Ph.D. at the Faculty of Economics in Ljubljana. I soon became director of the Institute of Macroeconomic Analysis in Ljubljana, which is basically a governmental institute for macroeconomic analysis. And after that, I was in 1998 nominated for the head of negotiating team for the accession of Slovenia to the European Union. In the meantime, I became also the minister without portfolio for European affairs. And in 2004, I have joined the European Commission. So my first real portfolio was science and research. And the second portfolio next 5 years was environment. While I was not able to choose the first one, but thank God it was tailor-made, I was quite insisting to get environment from a very simple reason, because I have believed that environment is actually the strongest economic portfolio if you understand environment in the right way. So finishing the second mandate, that was 2014. In the first mandate, actually, the major thing which I could mention is adoption of the European Research Council, which is today seen as a kind of lighthouse of European research. And in the second mandate, at the end of the mandate, I have proposed circular economy, which at that time was not known among yet politicians. It was known in scientific world, but in less than 10 years, it has become a kind of a global trend. And now, after that period, that was 2014, I started to chair, as you have already mentioned, the UNEP International Resource Panel. International Resource Panel, it's a kind of science policy interface in the area of natural resource management. So it's 40 scientists from all parts of the world, 35 countries in the steering committee, and we are dealing practically with all the questions related to natural resource management and connection to the economic system, which is the core driver that we are where we are. I'm also partner at SYSTEMIQ, chairing some other things like Forum for the Future of Agriculture, ThinkForest first, and so on. But my main activity is actually related to everything which is IRP based, so International Resource Panel based.
So we will touch many topics today, but let's start our discussion with climate policies. What are the key international agreements and treaties that are related to climate change?
Since one is coming practically very soon, these are so-called Conference of Parties, COPs, and we will soon see the Dubai COP, which is the COP number 28. And this Conference of Parties are basically meetings which are lasting some 10 days, where on one hand you have governments who are negotiating, and this is the formal part, but as much as the formal part is important, the informal part is also important. So that's the part where actually civil society, the representatives of the companies, then so anybody who has interest in the climate change, it's meeting and also presenting their thoughts and their developments, what they are doing in that context. And maybe what would be important to mention is that the scientific backbone of this UNFCCC, that's the climate COP, it's actually IPCC, International Panel for Climate Change. International Panel for Climate Change is a kind of a sister organization of the International Resource Panel, which I'm co-chairing. They are dealing with climate change. Then you have IPBES for biodiversity loss, and IRP, it's for the natural resource management. But these are core parts, and you might remember, for example, the Paris COP, which was quite successful and a kind of breakthrough COP. But the next one is soon on the agenda, and I sincerely hope that we will move ahead, because we are a bit lacking behind, as we all know.
Now that you mentioned that, how close are we to bringing EU goal of being climate neutral by 2050 and achieving 55% less emission reduction by 2030?
In different countries are in different position. One thing is clear, the efforts are going on, and quite serious efforts, in particular in the energy field. But another thing, it's also clear that if we will not broaden and deepen that approach, we will not reach the targets which we have set. In Europe, for example, we have set a target of reaching of net zero GHG emissions by 2050. I see basically three main blind spots why we are not there as we would actually need to be, and what needs to be done that we would go quicker and deeper. First is that a lot of public leaders, but I could basically set in broadly, many of us are not approaching to the questions in enough holistic system change way. So it's always a kind of a relatively narrow way of looking to the questions. And if we, for example, look to the questions how to achieve the target which I mentioned before till 2050, then we try to achieve it for whatever it will cost. And that forever it will cost might have quite serious side effects on many of the areas which are not exactly addressed in the climate talks. But if you would look directly only to the climate area, mainly the debate there is linked to the energy policies. And only recently also material story is coming on the table, because we have realized, and we will probably talk about that later, we have realized that without a very serious additional materials, it will be practically impossible to make the energy transition. So that's the first. The second is that in many cases we are not going enough to the core reasons why we are where we are. In that, when I'm saying that, I'm meaning in particular two things. One is that we don't go back to the natural resources, which are at the end the basis for our well-being, but are also the core reason that we are overshooting planetary boundaries, that we are causing climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution. So their use. And the second in that, it's basically linked to the market signals. So market signals as we are currently receiving are simply not leading us into sustainable direction. And we more or less know that. So if I simplify, one could say that production, financial capital, it's overvalued and over-rewarded. Human capital, it's undervalued and under-rewarded. And natural capital, even if we all know that it should have intrinsic value, when we talk in the market context, it's many times not having any value. So it's not valued, not priced, which means that basically the companies are using it for free and also destroying it. And these are the core reasons. So as long as we will have that kind of signals sent to us producers and consumers, we can just dream on that we will reach a kind of social, economic and environmental balance. So economic will always be in front of social and environmental. And the last reason, which is worth mentioning, in particular in the climate context we are talking about, is that a lot of our attention also in the climate COPs, which we mentioned before, is related to the supply side. So cleaning the supply side. But we are not really asking about who is consuming and who is actually surpassing planetary boundaries and living out of the safe operating space. So we need to add the demand side. So cleaning the supply side, so making the wrong model better, it's still not making the wrong model right. And when I say demand side, I don't mean only consumers. I mean basically everybody who is designing and influencing the demand side, from the governments and because they need to set the signals to the producers and consumers, right, to the companies who are, of course, bombarding us with their advertisements, and finally also to the consumers who have to act responsibly. But I think it's pretty critical that we stop ignoring this wasteful economic model. And in particular, all those demand side issues are important also if we want to get Global South on board, because these are critical questions which we are in climate talks not asking enough. And if we want Global South on board, we need to ask who is consuming and over-consuming, and who is actually overshooting the planetary boundaries. Otherwise, we will talk about financial compensation, which is currently basically what is happening. So in any meeting, those countries, and rightly so, are requesting more and more financial compensation. But listen, more financial compensation when we don't really go to the drivers and pressures and and correct the system will not do the trick. And unfortunately, we are not yet there.
Definitely. And do you see this economic model changing in the near future or not really?
Listen, what I see is that more and more people are understanding that this is the core problem. And more people are talking about that. But I don't see a clear signs and readiness, because it's very much connected to the essence of all what is driving our economics. And this is, of course, difficult. And all of us, from the first till the last, are basically used to a certain level of well-being we have achieved. And it's really difficult to step out of the comfort zone. And the latest modeling, it's mathematics and basically based on mathematics and physics, it's showing that the market economy is actually by definition driving in the direction that those who are better off are having more and those who are worse off are having less. So you need a kind of strong redistributive mechanisms behind, or you simply don't reach the world where we can talk about equity, equality, and the things which are quite fundamental. Because I think what is really important to understand is that if the conditions for environmental, including climate transformation, are not met, if the people don't accept them, they will not be accepted. So it's essential that those conditions are met, which means that you need to work on the social reforms hand in hand when it comes to the environmental efforts, or we will fail.
So you mentioned that energy is one of the things that people are mostly talking about when it comes to climate change, or at least it was. So this is also one of the things that I would like to talk about. And I would like to ask about the renewable energy sources and what position do they play in transitioning to a more sustainable energy system, and what are the challenges in this transition. And perhaps you can also mention nuclear power and how do you see that in comparison to other renewable energy sources.
We have seen recently some setbacks in some of the countries which were starting to go back to coal, which is certainly not the right way to go. And it's just giving a message that we do not consider climate change seriously enough. You know, when you are in policy making, you start to understand that in front of the governments are always urgent and important matters. And urgent matters are always on the table while important matters are somehow set aside. And that's why it's really, really important that the governments have a kind of people who take care that important matters are done in consistency with the urgent ones. Because one of the things which we have all learned is that taking painkillers will not heal the systemic diseases and actually just hide them and make them worse. And that's many times also the case when it comes to such kind of policies, when you react or act quickly on something which occurs as a kind of challenge and it's an urgent need. So going to the question which you have asked, so shift to renewable energy is of course critical, but only focusing on the energy field in a way like many times we are doing, which is basically this is how much of the energy needs are today, then let's extrapolate that to the future. And let's calculate how much of the renewable energy would need to replace the classical, today, fossil fuel-based energy sources. And then we come to the troubles because it's hard time to see the way through with all the renewable options. The classical renewable options are known from sun, wind, and water. Then the other options come into the play. And then, of course, first one, it's always the nuclear energy, because it's obviously that it's not causing the CO2 exhaust, but it has other environmental consequences, which we know very well. But also not only that, then we start to talk about carbon capture and sequestration, then we start to talk about the need to increase the bioenergy sources, which in other way we could maybe use them for food purposes. Then we start to talk, when we talk about minerals, about deep sea mining. So if we would want to somehow avoid those debates or at least limit them, then the central question which we should ask, and it's not asked frequently enough, is how can we provide human needs by using least energy and materials, natural resources? Because there are many of possibilities when you can do that. So today we have created wasteful system. It's simpler, easier and cheaper to go to new resources instead of try to keep your products, whatever, longer in the service, instead of designing them in a way that they are reusable, that they are repairable. Because today we are even experiencing the practice that it's cheaper and easier to buy something new instead of repair it, because repairing is more expensive. And if the situation is like that, people will do that, which is extremely resource intensive and energy intensive. And the consequence of that is, of course, climate change, biodiversity loss, and so on. So when I talk, for example, that we need to accompany the models which are talking about resource efficiency with the resource sufficiency, I'm not talking about only consumption, which is part of the answer. So we can meet some of the needs. So we are exaggerating sometimes, and we know that particularly in saturated high-income economies with what we are actually piling around ourselves. But I talk also about the sufficiency on the energy and material side. Can we meet the same human needs in much more energy and resource-efficient way? That's the question, because at the end of the day, we have to know we don't need car, we need mobility. We don't need light bulbs, we need light. We don't actually need houses, we need a place, a shelter. We don't need pesticides, we need healthy plants. We don't need a refrigerator, we need cool and healthy food. And I can continue. So these are human needs, and there are much more efficient ways to provide them from the energy and resource perspective way than we are doing today, because it is pretty obvious and clear that the current system in which we are living, it's simply wasteful. And one of the things which is quite critical question today, very much present all around the world, in particular in European Union, because as you probably know, Europe is pretty much import dependent when it comes to energy. That's what we have learned very quickly in this terrible thing which is happening in Ukraine. But also when it comes to different materials, critical raw materials, where we are geographically exposed and we are importing majority of them, those which we are building in high-tech products. And when it comes to energy transition, it is pretty clear that on the supply side of the renewable energy, according to IEA, International Energy Agency, the needs till 2040 would be approximately 6 times more than today. And on the demand side, which is actually using energy, the typical example is electric car, which needs somehow, according to their estimates, 10 times more different materials than the conventional combustion car today. Which doesn't mean that we should not go that way when we talk about car or when we talk about the renewable energy. But we should, in the first place, ask, can we do that more rationally? So if I give you one example, cleaning the steel industry, it's of course extremely important, because now we know that steel industry, it's very much polluting and also causing a lot of impacts on the climate change. But if we don't ask in the first place how much of that steel is actually really needed and how much it's maybe parked in totally underused cars or empty houses, we are simply missing the point. So that's what I talk when I talk about how to meet human needs in most resource efficient way. And for that, this philosophy, looking through the human need, it's really, really important, because it's also bringing to different kind of solutions. It's different to talk about car as a solution or mobility as a solution. It's totally different philosophy. It's totally different approach. It's totally different policies which are behind. And the new Global Resource Outlook, which we are preparing in IRP, and it will be released at UNEA, United Nations Environment Assembly, February next year, will entirely talk about human needs. It will not talk anymore about sectors. It will be about food, nutrition. It will be about mobility. It will be about housing. It will be about other human needs. But in particular, our focus will be on those human needs which are most resource intensive. Why? Because they are those who are the reasons that we are overusing the resources and the energy. So it's quite a long story. And in these critical raw materials, we are simply making shortcuts in our policy currently, looking in particular how future new mines which we will have to open needs to be organized in more environmentally friendly way, and value added should more stay with those countries and regions which are the origin of those materials, which is all good. We are also asking the question from the circularity point of view, how much of these critical raw materials can we save by recycling in those products which are containing those critical raw materials? But we are entirely missing the question, can we redesign our resource-intensive systems like mobility or housing so that we would, in the first place, use less of that energy and less of those resources? Of course, it's not too economically attractive, but listen, we want to survive, isn't it so?
My question here would be, how would you educate people to kind of adopt the view that you now presented, right? Something that is more long-term, and perhaps it's not the cheapest way. For example, just using my parents as an example, as you used the electric car before. So they always say, why would we go for an electric car? It's so much more expensive. And it's just a lot of these options that are more friendly for environment and for recycling and things like that, or use recycled materials and things like that, doesn't make enough sense economically, are not cheaper, and people, I feel like, they don't want to reach for those options.
You will certainly remember that 5 minutes ago we talked about free bottlenecks or free blind spots which are existing, and the major question is linked to the signals which we are getting as producers and consumers. You know, if I'm a consumer, and of course then the public authorities are of course saying to me, yeah, of course, you have to be careful what you are buying. You have to recycle the things and select waste and so on. If they are telling me that I have to behave more responsibly, but at the same time, when I go to the market and anything like that, and you mentioned your parents, is that meeting the market reality, which is if you want to buy electric car or if you want to buy environmentally produced food, it's normally more expensive, which means it makes no sense. So if you would look it through the eyes, as I was taught years ago on the economic faculty, they would basically say you have to behave stupidly and then you will behave responsibly. But sorry, this will not work. So if you have on one hand market signals sending you left and telling you, come on, it's no necessity that you behave responsibly because you can afford more. And then regulation, it's basically telling you the opposite. You have to be careful, you have to follow that. These are the things which we would, what you create is a lot of confusion on the markets. You have on one hand business producers who are lobbying heavily that the things would not change. Why? Because the market signals are telling them the opposite. And you have a lot of confused consumers who, again, are on one hand are asked to be more responsible, but on the other hand, we are basically giving them the signal that this doesn't make sense. So market signals should change. And as long as they will not change, and if I just start with quite concrete examples, which are, by the way, not so difficult, it's pretty much connected to the goodwill tax system. We will have to use the tax system better. So finance ministers and ministries normally see their major role keeping the budgets in balance, which is of course important. But they are the major provider of the market signals. So taxing the things more, which we would like to see less. Taxing the things less, which we would like to see more. Using the public procurement, which is huge amount of GDP for the purposes of transition which would lead us in the right direction, or using the state subsidies in a reasonable way. Do you know maybe the figure published by IMF when the state subsidies for fossil fuels were the highest? 2022 globally, last year. So decades we talk already about that, and fossil fuel subsidies are still going on and higher. They are higher. So it's hypocrisy per excellence. I can't say anything else. So for me, this is the basic hypocrisy indicator. And if I would go one step further, tax havens, why we are tolerating them? It's basically a kind of escape room for rich companies and rich people, even not to pay the fair taxes. So these are the things which simply does not make sense. And with that, we could do a lot of different signals, differentiate the signals as they are currently given to producers and consumers. And I think, as I said at the beginning, there is a lot, it's a courage and goodwill. And it's not actually not knowing or not understanding. I've been in policy making enough time, and I can tell you that I haven't met anybody in any government who would be against removing fossil fuel subsidies. And why the hell we are still having them and they are higher than they were before? Because nobody really dares in reality, or at least many really do not dare to remove them. So many of those things are possible, but we simply don't do them because it's a comfort zone, it's difficult, and it's not aligned with basic interests and power game, which we see in politics and in the business sector.
I completely agree. And we kind of already touched on the next question that I want to ask, which is about greenwashing. So what are your thoughts on greenwashing, and why is it a concerning issue in today's world? And maybe you can give some examples of industries that are accused of greenwashing.
Yeah, I can hardly give you the examples. In the International Resource Panel, we are more or less dealing with, we are not going on company level. We are dealing with trends, with trying to show what could be, and from that somehow creating a kind of policy proposals also. But yeah, you are right, greenwashing, it's worrying, and unfortunately it's still existing. It's present. Actually, if we are frank, manipulation with consumers, it's not limited only to the environmental claims, but it's quite an established practice we still face. So just open the TV and listen to the commercials. If everything what they are saying you there, we would be all looking like 10 years kids and living forever. Everything is the best, and everything it's making you better looking and enjoying more and more healthy and everything. So I think it's difficult. There is no real peer review about those things and how to actually stop them. So it's a lot of, I dare to say, even if I'm not an expert there, that there is a lot of legislation which is working against greenwashing. But implementation there, it's hard, it's difficult. And you need to have very well-established systems, a lot of inspectors and so on. And sometimes somehow this proportionality is not reached. But it is the problem. Greenwashing is the problem in particular because if this exists, then the real and actually very important steps are met with a doubt, because we do not trust and we do not believe, and trust is everything. If you do not trust something or somebody, you will simply not trust, and then in that case, you know how it's our normal reaction. So I think it's I know that European Commission is working a lot on that. For example, one typical example where they are working a lot now, it's product passport. So it's actually that each product would need to contain the history. So from where it originate, what are actually essential ingredients, and so the beginning and the end. And this product passport, it's quite a promising thing. But still, if I go one step back, informing consumer and empowering consumer, it's important. And our rational, responsible behavior, it's important. But if you have then price signals which are leading you elsewhere, again, you have a problem. So I think it's really important that we stop this dichotomy between regulation sending us one direction and market incentives sending us elsewhere.
And now we're going to turn a little bit to to the nature and to biodiversity. How has human activity undermined the regenerative capacity of the Earth ecosystems, and what are the consequences of this on climate stability and biodiversity?
Yeah, I'm also, by the way, a member of the Club of Rome, so maybe using in that context a bit of their experiences. So they have nicely put that the world has changed from an empty world which was dominated by nature to a full world which is now dominated by humans. And in the empty world, the limiting factors were labor and infrastructure for human well-being, while in the full world, it's actually natural resources and environmental things, which are limiting factor of human well-being, which basically means that if you want to talk economics of the future, you can't talk about that without taking into account how much can nature absorb and how much is there and how can we use them in a way that we don't cause the side effects as we are causing it today. So already, if you remember, in 1972, when the famous limits to growth were issued, they warned that unlimited material growth and consumption on a finite planet would eventually lead to the collapse and decline. Many were not accepting that, but we can easily say that 50 years after that, yeah, like always, you are not entirely hitting 100% everything, but they have hit the direction practically exactly like it's happening. And one thing which you also have to remember is that when the limits to growth were released, there were on the planet 3.8 billion people. That was 50 years ago, and we have now surpassed 8 billion. So I like to say that we have moved from the limits to growth to the growth of limits, because that's actually what is happening in this 50 years period. So the consequences of the climate change are more than clear. So since you have lived, hopefully, this summer in Slovenia, you have seen them so clearly that it's, even today, if you look outside and what is actually coming in the evening, we know that this is becoming serious. It's really becoming serious. And Slovenia was known as a sunny side of the Alps. So the message which it's coming across, there are no more safe places. And practically it will reach everybody. Only that some will be hit more and the others will maybe have a bit easier beginning, hopefully also the end. But also in the biodiversity which you mentioned, according to Living Planet report that was released last year by WWF, planet's wildlife populations, mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles and fish have seen 69% drop on average since 1970, in the last 50 years. So simply there is no lack of scientific facts or evidence about human impacts. And this strong alignment of messages which is coming from the three science policy interfaces, IPCC, IPBES, and IRP, based on the most comprehensive scientific assessment, must simply be considered as a statement of urgency from the scientific community. Yeah, with decisive action and of course, political courage, I still believe that sustainable future, meaning a decent life for all within planetary boundaries, it's possible. But more than technological or economic challenge, I think this is actually a moral challenge and moral choice, which we have to do. Because our relationship with nature, because one of the core problems is that for example, contemporary economics is not considering humans as part of nature, but like of external to nature. But one of the core problems is that this relationship between humans and the rest of nature, it's not stable. It's actually something which needs to be changed, and that is not only environmental question, it's also economic, it's also equity, security question at the end of the day. And when we talk about those questions, I think how to solve it, it's pretty straightforward. It can be solved only in two ways. One is with collective wisdom and really in-depth cooperation. And second is in the hard and painful way. There is no third way. And unfortunately, the history is showing that too many times choose the second. But let's hope.
Yeah, would be very difficult to reach the collaboration.
Indeed, but one thing which we have to understand is that basically we are the first generation ever on this planet which is living on socio-ecological space of planetary scope. So even the Second World War was not planetary scope. It was regional wars which were happening on many places. But the war threats actually became global with the invention of nuclear weapons. And we have seen COVID, we are seeing climate change, we are seeing internet, we are seeing trade. All that, it's actually becoming global now. And that, of course, this connectivity which we are facing, it's actually leading to a simple conclusion that our individual and collective responsibility has enormously increased comparing to the past. You hear the debates which are now about artificial intelligence. This is a typical, again, global case, because IT, it's obviously global. And if we do not cooperate, how do we think that we will solve those issues if one will want to short-term benefit for the not taking into account the long-term consequences? And the only thing to avoid that is actually to agree that we will not do that. And that's also the worry with IA, that some companies will simply for their private benefits risk too much. And when you go that way, then, of course, in the circumstances as we are today, being the first generation living in this connectivity of global space, that's a shortcut to disaster.
Indeed. My next question would be addressing the European Commission's proposal for the nature restoration law. What was the proposal for the nature restoration law, and why were they rejected from the European Parliament Agriculture and Fisheries Committees?
Nature restoration law was more about the role of nature, which should play in solutions. But of course, if you want the nature to play a more important role in solutions, you basically have to correct some of the mistakes where we have destroyed nature in the past. That's why nature restoration is needed, But any restoration, of course, it's somehow setting the things right, and of course could be seen also as part of the typical standard argumentation which we have heard, that this will be heavy burden and burden for competitiveness, in particular when it comes to agricultural sector. And that was the case, which was pretty much behind. And frankly, it was quite a serious political test. At the end, ended positively after some serious compromises, of course, in the European Parliament plenary vote. But I think the message which one can read behind is that actually the reality which we are seeing, and many are basically very much reacting on that, of all the developments around us, which you see in conflicts and their consequences, is something which will make policy making in the future probably even more difficult, because you have seen immediately what was the reaction of public on increased energy or food prices. And by the way, it was quite an ideal moment to increase the energy prices. And questions like I've got from some people around me, oh my God, I will now have to think where I will drive. Yeah, of course, that's the point. So, if something is seen as not an economic signal anymore, so that we can all basically afford it too easily. And here I will repeat, in the first place, you have to fix the social part, because I don't want to create or to talk about the world where these inequalities will give the privileged ones possibility to do it and unprivileged not. And but it's clear that economic signals should play a role in that. We think when we buy something, do something, go somewhere. And I think that is quite important. But when it comes to those economic questions, I think a really important thing is to understand that any transition in the history was truly an economic opportunity, in particular for those who are innovative, those who dare, those who understand well the challenges which we are facing and we have to fix. And but of course, normally those are not the loudest. The loudest are those who don't see that future for themselves, but see the benefits of the current situation and want to protect it. And this is quite normal. And here it's basically a clear role for public policy makers to defend the public interest. That's what they are paid for.
While I was researching a bit for this interview, I came across something very interesting that is one of the technologies of future, let's say, that is, we know that cattle is a methane emitter and the cow emits huge amounts up to 100 kilograms of methane per year. So recently I've seen that there are feed additives for cattle that would basically inhibit the enzymes for lesser production of methane, which would basically make cows emit like 30 to 40% less methane per year. Do you see this kind of a thing taking off? And if we bring Slovenia here a bit in the picture, do you see, let's say, Slovenian farmers maybe taking a part in such innovative approaches?
I don't see why not, because here you are not talking about the number of the cattle. But I'm not aware of that option, to be honest. But of course, one can say two things in that context. First, methane, it's an important greenhouse gas, which in the past was not seriously enough taken into account. And second, the cattle is an important emitter. These are two facts. And while the solution which you mentioned would be definitely welcomed, I think it's the questions will not end up there. So we need to ask also about more balanced diets, more eating more local, and so on. And of course, this is important part of the answer also. If I summarize, I do, of course, believe in technological solutions because they can contribute. But we have seen from the history that many of the technological solutions could become, in certain period, also new lock-ins and problems. And that's why I firmly believe that technological solutions should be accompanied also with the real in-depth system change, with behavioral part of the story, because, as I have already mentioned, just improving the current wrong model doesn't make model right. And I think we need to basically really count on the combination of both of this technological but also social innovation.
Maybe now that we are going towards the end of our conversation, maybe can you suggest some actionable steps that we can take to make lesser of an impact on climate?
Where to start? I would basically start by saying that everything starts with the North Star. And North Star of which today practically all governments and all of us are using, it's GDP, gross domestic product. Unfortunately, gross domestic product, which is the North Star, which we are following, it's not leading us to the north, but it's leading us somewhere else. So it's not showing us the well-being. It's actually showing us the economic growth. And well-being, it's not exactly economic growth. Even the Kuznets, the author of the concept of the GDP, some 100 years ago already said that it's not measuring well-being, but we are still there. Even more, we are talking a lot about GDP growth. Instead, we would talk about the level of the GDP we have reached, because you don't go into the shop and say, listen, my salary is growing, I don't know how much, and they would give you something, but you are going to the shop and tell how much money you have in your pocket, and that's actually the level. And I think that too many times we are simply, this is connected with the current level of employment, which is a bit delayed, but it's very closely linked. It's connected with current flows into the budgets, and that's why GDP growth is so important. But in essence, it's not a measure for well-being. So I firmly believe that we should shift from this prevailing resource wasteful economic-based approach, which is measuring the amount of products and services put on the market through GDP, to a more sophisticated measurement, which is linking social, economic, and environmental story towards an economy which is basically effectively meeting human needs. The reason it's very simple. The current logic is both. It's ethically and ecologically unsustainable. So the very concrete things which we already talked about are about signals to producers and consumers. So all the things which we mentioned in the context of the tax system before, from, the levels of value-added tax to the subsidies to public procurement, tax havens, and so on, all are very concrete and very important. One important part of the solution could be new business models, which would basically be more based on this logic of a human need, so which would be more based on services rather than ownership, which again, it's difficult. But it was more difficult in my generation than in your generation, because in my generation, our parents were living in poor conditions. And that's why we were all taught that having our own house, having our own car are actually a kind of preconditions of success. While the young generation, it's not so much anymore ownership biased. And you think much more in this logic of human needs, while we were more using the logic of products and ownership. And there are two reasons. One obvious reason is that you are better, more aware than we are about environmental threats and consequences. At the end of the day, it's more about your life than our life. And the second is, unfortunately, many times you don't have an option. You simply have to go that way because the way how we have actually pocketed our pockets and not really giving an option for decent life for our future generations, it's sometimes quite frightening and unfair. And I think that we would need a kind of intergenerational agreement where we would fix some of those things and better integrate the young generation into solutions. But critical point, which we have also already mentioned a few times, is this social acceptance. For example, the Club of Rome recently published Earth for All. I don't know if you have heard, it's actually 50 years after the Limits to Growth. And in their model, there are two scenarios: too little, too late, which I will not talk about because it's too little, too late. And the second is the giant leap, which is the most ambitious policies ever. And there are two conclusions which are coming out of that modeling. One is that we will reach social tipping points before we will reach environmental tipping points. So focus on that if you want to have environmental transformation in reality. And the second is that, which is quite worrying concerning climate change, that even with the most ambitious policies, we will hit 2 degrees Celsius, and only there the things will start to change. So lots of the things can hardly be touched, can hardly be in that way integrated, because the consequences that we are where we are today are in the past, and it's hard to change that quickly. So time is needed, and there is no, like many are saying, short-term and long-term policies. Everything is short-term, and only the consequences are sometimes long-term. But that doesn't mean that this short-term policy would not need to be very much taken into account. But let me maybe conclude that part by just one thing, because many are saying that or believing that business sector is against that, it's not aware about the challenges. But World Economic Forum, which is basically the representatives of the core of the thinking of business sector, in their global risk perception survey 22-23, I think they are doing it on 2 years. Actually, it is based on the survey among the business leaders. And in 10 years perspective, what are the core risks which these business leaders are seeing? On first place, failure to mitigate climate change. On the second, failure to climate change adoption. On the third, natural disasters and extreme weather events. On the fourth, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. And on the sixth, natural resource crisis. 5 out of 6 are environmental. So they know very well, that this is their major competitiveness, threat and challenge. And sometimes even the policymakers believe that they are making them an effort by helping them, by killing them slowly. It's not actually helping them. So you need to create conditions today, have very clear direction, very clear strategic support, and align all the policies with the funding options which the governments have. And then the things are possible.
And for my last question, I would just like to ask you if you would have any suggestions on books, podcasts, or any other literature for listeners who would be interested in learning more about the topics that we covered today.
My advice would be the same as I'm getting from my son when I'm asking him similar questions. How should I fix that or find that? And he's basically saying, do you don't know how to Google? And then I said, I know. And but if there is one book I would recommend you, because I was basically contributing to its development. It's a System Change Compass. We have released it 2-3 years ago, Club of Rome and SYSTEMIQ. And I think it's super nice reading and very practical of what could be done and how could be done, and that we don't end up on a bit pessimistic note. By the way, I remain optimist because from a simple subjective reason, optimists live longer and better. But that we don't end up on that note. I think the lessons which we could learn from COVID are very much, in a way, quite positive. So if we take something as serious, we act. One lesson, it's also that, of course, the governments act a bit too late and only when it's unavoidable, which we have seen also in the COVID. So as long as it was in China, oh, it's there. Oh, it's in Africa. Oh, in Italy. Yeah, but it's not in our country. Oh my God, it's in our country. So, but we act. When we see it seriously, we act. And we can act dramatically. Can you imagine that we would basically try to introduce in 2019 work from home as it's today's standard practice without COVID? No way. Today, it's fine. But it's a revolutionary thing. And by the way, with good consequences on the environment, definitely. Or since we talked a lot about the human needs, if you would ask yourself how many clothes you needed during the COVID comparing to the pre-COVID period, you would also get quite clear answer. So this is human need, but otherwise we have pretty much a lot of induced human needs. And if you would ask yourself even the second part of the question, were you happier or less happier? You would find out actually that you were happier because you were wearing the things which are comfortable and you like them. So things are possible, but of course, one precondition for everything, for this positive ending, is that we take climate change and other environmental challenges more seriously.